She set my field on fire on a Tuesday morning while I was in town buying fence posts. By the time I saw the smoke from the highway and turned my truck around and pushed it to 90 on a county road that was not designed for 90. 40 acres of coastal Bermuda grass that my grandfather had planted in 1971 were gone. Not damaged, not partially burned, gone. Black ground from the eastern fence line to the creek bed, still smoking in places. The smell of it reaching me through the truck windows half a mile before I got there. Cheryl Fontaine was standing at the edge of my property when I arrived. Pearl white SUV parked on the road behind her. HOA president badge on its lanyard around her neck. The particular expression of a woman who has done something she considers both justified and impressive, and is waiting to explain why. She had hired a crew, she had given the instruction, she had watched it happen. And then the wind changed. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I spent 23 years in the United States Army. I have been in situations that involved actual fire, actual danger, actual consequences that cannot be undone. I am not a man who loses his composure easily or reacts before he has thought carefully about what the correct reaction is. But standing at the gate of my grandfather's ranch, watching 40 acres of pasture still smoking, while Cheryl Fontaine explained to me that the field had contained invasive weed species that violated Meadowbrook Ranch estate's community standards. I felt something settle in my chest that I recognized from the field as the specific quality of cold clarity that comes when a situation has become simple. Not easy, simple. The objective was clear, the method was clear. The outcome was going to be what it was going to be, and there was nothing complicated about any of it. What was not yet clear to Cheryl, what would not become clear to her for several weeks, by which time it would be considerably too late to matter, was that the wind changing direction that Tuesday morning had done something she had not anticipated and could not undo. It had burned her field too, not a little, not the edge of it. 47 acres of her own improved pasture. The pasture she had spent 2 years developing as the showcase centerpiece of what she called her ranch aesthetic. The pasture she had posted photographs of on the Meadowbrook Ranch estate's community social media page with captions about proper land stewardship and community standards. Gone black. Still smoking when I arrived. The fire having crossed my eastern fence line when the wind shifted and traveled through her property with the particular efficiency that fire achieves when the fuel is plentiful and the wind is cooperative, and nobody has thought carefully enough about what happens when things do not go according to plan. Cheryl's expression when she realized I was not looking at my field, but at hers was the expression I have been thinking about ever since. It moved through several stages very quickly. Confusion, calculation. The specific rearrangement of features that happens when a person understands something they do not want to understand and is trying to find a way not to understand it. There was no way not to understand it. The wind had changed, the fire had traveled. And the woman who had set the fire was standing at the boundary of 2 fields that were both black and both still smoking, and both going to require a great deal of explaining. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are watching from, because this story does not end with 2 burned fields. It ends with a federal arson investigation, a criminal conviction, a civil judgment that took everything Cheryl Fontaine had spent 15 years building in Meadowbrook Ranch estates, and a lesson about fire and wind, and the specific consequences of decisions made without sufficient thought about what happens when the variables do not cooperate, that I think every single person watching this needs to hear. Stay with me, every word of this is real, and the part about the wind is only the beginning. My name is Captain William Reed Calloway, retired, 52 years old. 23 years in the United States Army. The last 8 of them in logistics and infrastructure roles that had taken me to places where I learned more about fire behavior, wind patterns, and the physics of combustion than most people learn in a lifetime of safe circumstances. When I retired and came back to my grandfather's ranch in Blanco County, Texas, that knowledge came with me. I did not expect it to be relevant in the way it turned out to be relevant. But it was. My grandfather, Elijah Reed Calloway, had purchased the ranch in 1962. 312 acres of Texas hill country land. The kind of country that is beautiful in a way that requires you to look at it for a while before you understand why. Not the immediate dramatic beauty of mountains or ocean, but the slower beauty of cedar and live oak and limestone outcroppings, and the particular quality of light that the Texas hill country produces at dawn and dusk, when the angles are low, and everything has a clarity and warmth that you cannot reproduce in a photograph, and that people who grew up with it carry somewhere in their nervous system for the rest of their lives regardless of where they go. Elijah had run cattle on the land for 30 years, and had been methodical about its improvement in the way that ranchers of his generation were methodical, patient. Long-term thinking, investing in the land with the understanding that good pasture is built over decades, not seasons. The coastal Bermuda grass he planted in the eastern fields in 1971 was part of that investment. Coastal Bermuda is a warm season perennial that, once established on good soil with adequate moisture, produces high-quality forage reliably for decades and is difficult to kill even under drought conditions. Elijah had planted it, managed it carefully, and passed it to my father, who had passed it to me when he passed 4 years ago. And the field that Cheryl Fontaine burned had been producing reliable forage for 52 years without interruption. The ranch had been surrounded by development in the preceding decade. The Texas hill country had discovered itself as a destination and a lifestyle proposition for people leaving the cities. And the consequence for places like Blanco County was the fragmentation of large ranches into smaller parcels sold to people who wanted the aesthetic of rural land without the full commitment of agricultural operation. Meadowbrook Ranch estates had been developed on what had been the neighboring Whitmore Ranch. 700 acres, divided into parcels ranging from 10 to 50 acres, each with deed restrictions requiring certain minimum improvements and aesthetic standards that the developer had packaged as a premium community feature. The HOA that governed Meadowbrook Ranch estates had been a reasonable body for its first 3 years. Then Cheryl Fontaine had been elected president. Cheryl was 54 years old. Relocated from Houston, where she had apparently spent a successful career in commercial property management, before deciding that Texas hill country living was the appropriate context for her retirement years. She drove a pearl-white Chevrolet Suburban with running boards and a lift kit that suggested serious off-road capability, and was in practice used exclusively on paved roads between her property and the Fredericksburg Whole Foods. She wore her HOA president badge on a lanyard even during casual neighborhood events, which told you most of what you needed to know about her relationship with the concept of authority. She had moved into Meadowbrook Ranch estates 18 months before she ran for HOA president, which was enough time to understand the community's fault lines and position herself as the solution to problems she had, in several cases, helped to create. Her campaign had focused on community standards and property value protection, and the need for consistent enforcement of the deed restrictions that the developer had written, and that the previous board had enforced with the casual flexibility of people who believed reasonable neighbors could work things out without escalating every disagreement into a formal citation process. Cheryl did not share this belief. Within 4 months of taking office, she had issued more violation notices than the previous board had issued in 3 years. She had created an inspection protocol that required quarterly review of every property in the community. She had hired a part-time compliance officer, a retired code enforcement inspector named Dale Briggs, who had the particular combination of bureaucratic precision and social obliviousness that made him genuinely dangerous in a role that required judgment as well as rule application. My property was adjacent to Meadowbrook Ranch, estates on its western boundary, which meant I was technically not a member of the HOA and technically not subject to its authority. This distinction was clear in the original deed restrictions, which applied only to parcels within the platted subdivision, and it was clear in my deed, which predated the subdivision by 60 years and contained no reference to any HOA or community standards document. Cheryl did not accept this distinction. She had taken the position, communicated to me in a certified letter 3 months after her election, that my property's proximity to the subdivision created what she called community impact obligations that she was empowered to enforce under a broad reading of the deed restrictions nuisance provisions. The nuisance provisions in the Meadowbrook deed restrictions were designed to prevent things like commercial operations in residential areas and the storage of junk vehicles, and the keeping of livestock in quantities inconsistent with the parcel size. They were not designed to give an HOA president authority over a neighboring agricultural property that predated the subdivision by 6 decades. I wrote back explaining this, politely, with legal citations. I sent a copy to the HOA's attorney. Cheryl sent 2 more letters. My neighbor on the northern boundary. A retired schoolteacher named Frank Sutherland, who had lived on his 10 acres in Meadowbrook for 6 years, and who had been the first person in the community to tell me that Cheryl's election was going to cause problems. Called me the week after I received Cheryl's second letter. Frank had been keeping records since Cheryl's first month in office with the organizational habit of a man who had spent 30 years managing classrooms and understood that documentation is the difference between a complaint and a case. Frank's records showed that Cheryl had been systematically citing properties along the western boundary of the subdivision, the properties closest to my ranch, for violations that properties in the interior of the community were committing without consequence. His analysis, which he presented to me in a manila folder organized by date and violation type, with the meticulous care of a retired educator who takes record-keeping seriously, showed that the citation rate for western boundary properties was 4 times the citation rate for interior properties, and that the violations cited were consistently minor, while more significant violations in the interior went unaddressed. Frank had a theory about why. 2 of the western boundary properties had sold in the past 18 months. Both had been purchased by a development entity called Hill Country Premier Properties, LLC. Frank had looked up the entity's registration with the Texas Secretary of State. The registered agent was a man named Douglas Fontaine, Cheryl's brother. I added this to my own growing file and called my attorney. James Acaffer had been practicing property and agricultural law in the Texas Hill Country for 20 years. He was methodical and thorough, and had the quality I valued most in legal counsel, which was a refusal to tell clients what they wanted to hear when the truth was more complicated, and an equal refusal to understate what the law clearly supported. When I described what Frank and I had assembled, he listened carefully and asked precise questions, and then said he wanted to review everything before offering an assessment. He called me back in 4 days. He said the pattern Frank had documented was consistent with what he described as targeted value suppression, a scheme in which manufactured violations and HOA pressure are used to make specific properties feel burdensome to own, leading to below-market sales to a connected buyer. He said he had seen it twice before in the Hill Country in the preceding 5 years, both times involving development interests that wanted to assemble land for resort or residential projects in areas where individual landowners would not sell at market prices, but would sell at suppressed prices when ownership became sufficiently unpleasant. He also said something that became important later. He said that if Cheryl's harassment campaign ever crossed the line from administrative overreach into actual property damage, the legal picture would change dramatically, and the options available to me would multiply considerably. The field was coastal Bermuda, high-quality established pasture. Worth, James told me when I asked him to think about it in advance. Approximately $8,000 per acre in replacement value when you accounted for the establishment cost and the years of lost production during the establishment period. 40 acres, the math was not complicated. What was complicated was how Cheryl had justified it to herself, which I have thought about many times since and have concluded reflects a specific cognitive pattern that develops in people who have operated with unchallenged authority for long enough that the distinction between what they are permitted to do and what they want to do has become unclear to them. She had decided the field contained invasive species. She had decided invasive species were a community nuisance. She had decided she was empowered to address community nuisances on adjacent properties under her expansive reading of the deed restrictions. and she had decided to address it by burning rather than by any of the several less destructive methods that are standard practice for invasive species management in Texas agricultural contexts. Apparently because burning was faster and more decisive, and because she had done it on her own property the previous year without incident. What she had not done was check the wind forecast. What she had not done was consult anyone with actual agricultural fire management experience about the behavior of fire in coastal Bermuda grass under the specific wind conditions present that morning. What she had not done was consider what would happen if the wind, which had been from the north when the fire was set, shifted to the south as it did within 40 minutes of ignition, which anyone familiar with Texas hill country, weather patterns in that season would have recognized as a predictable possibility rather than an unforeseeable accident. I had been in town buying fence posts. My ranch manager, a man named Hector Vasquez, who had been working the property since my father's time, and who knew it the way people know land they have worked for decades, had been on the northern pasture repairing a water gap when he saw the smoke. He had called me first, and then driven toward the eastern field, and arrived to find the fire already crossing into Cheryl's property with the particular speed that fire achieves when the wind is behind it, and the fuel is dry and established, and nobody has cut a fire break. Hector had called 911. The Blanco County Volunteer Fire Department had responded with the efficiency of people who understand that fire in dry Texas grass moves faster than the vehicles chasing it, and that getting ahead of it matters more than getting to it. By the time they arrived, the fire had made its own decisions about where it was going, and the decisions had been comprehensive. Both fields black, done. The fire investigator arrived the following morning. His name was Marcus Webb, and he had been with the Texas State Fire Marshal's office for 16 years, and approached the scene with the methodical attention of someone who has investigated a great deal of fires, and understands that fire tells its story in the physical evidence it leaves if you know how to read it. He walked the origin point carefully. He examined the burn patterns. He took samples from multiple locations. He photographed everything systematically and asked questions of everyone present, with the precision of someone building a record rather than having a conversation. He asked Cheryl directly whether she had authorized the burning of the field. She said she had authorized weed abatement on what she characterized as community-adjacent nuisance vegetation. He asked whether she had obtained a burn permit from the county. She said she had not believed one was required for weed abatement. He noted in his records that a burn permit is required for any open burning in Blanco County, regardless of the characterization of the material being burned. He asked whether she had notified the adjacent property owner before the burn. She said she had not believed notification was required for action taken under HOA authority. He noted that HOA authority does not extend to adjacent properties, not within the subdivision. I was standing approximately 15 feet from this conversation. Close enough to hear every word, not close enough to participate. I had my phone in my hand, and I was recording the audio with the recording app I had downloaded the previous evening, when I understood that the conversations that were going to happen at my property in the coming days were conversations whose exact content was going to matter. Texas is a one-party consent state. I did not need Cheryl's permission to record a conversation I was participating in or, as my attorney later confirmed, a conversation I was close enough to that my presence was known to the parties. The recording was legally obtained. It was also, when I sent it to James that evening, exactly the kind of evidence he described as the gift that keeps giving. James filed a civil complaint the following week. The defendants were Cheryl Fontaine personally, Meadowbrook Ranch Estates HOA as an entity, and the weed abatement company Cheryl had hired, whose own liability exposure for executing an unpermitted burn on property they had not verified ownership of was substantial, and whose attorney, upon receiving the complaint, immediately began the process of cooperating with everyone who would accept cooperation in exchange for reduced exposure. The claims were negligence, trespass, conversion, destruction of agricultural property. and intentional interference with agricultural operations. The damages calculation James prepared was detailed and specific. 40 acres of established coastal Bermuda grass at $8,000 per acre replacement value was $320,000. Lost forage production during the 3 to 5 year establishment period for the replacement planting. Calculated at current hay prices and the carrying capacity of the field. Added another $140,000. Fencing damage, where the fire had burned through wooden posts along the boundary lines, added $23,000. Emergency response, costs that Blanco County had billed to the responsible party added $11,000. The total was $494,000 before attorney fees, and before the punitive damages claim that James included based on the intentional nature of Cheryl's action, and her admitted knowledge that she was burning on or adjacent to property she did not own. The fire marshal's investigation ran parallel to the civil case. Marcus Webb's report, delivered 6 weeks after the fire, concluded that the burn had been intentionally set without a required permit, had not been contained to the property where it originated, had spread to adjacent property as a direct result of inadequate precautions, and had caused documented agricultural and property damage. The report recommended referral for criminal prosecution under Texas agricultural burning statutes, which carry penalties including fines and imprisonment for unpermitted burns that damage adjacent property. The Blanco County District Attorney received the referral. His name was Robert Chen, and he had been in the office for 11 years and had prosecuted agricultural arson cases before, and understood both the legal framework and the community significance of fire-related offenses in a county where dry grass and cedar, and the particular Texas hill country topography, create fire conditions that everyone who lives there understands are genuinely dangerous. He reviewed the fire marshal's report and the supporting documentation, and the recording I had provided to the investigation, and filed criminal charges against Cheryl Fontaine for criminal negligence causing property damage, violation of burn permit requirements, and 1 count of criminal mischief. Cheryl's response to the civil complaint had been immediate and confident. She retained a Houston litigation firm, whose reputation for aggressive defense she had apparently researched carefully before hiring, and their initial filings characterized the fire as an unforeseeable accident caused by sudden weather changes, denied that Cheryl had authority to authorize burning outside subdivision boundaries, and challenged the damages calculation on multiple grounds. The confidence of the filings reflected the belief that a well-resourced defense could complicate the evidentiary picture sufficiently to produce a settlement considerably below the claimed damages. What the Houston firm had not fully accounted for was Frank Sutherland's files. Frank had been keeping records for 18 months, and his documentation of the pattern of selective enforcement, combined with the 2 property sales to Douglas Fontaine's LLC and the timeline of Cheryl's citation campaigns, transformed the civil case from an agricultural damage claim into something that had much more serious dimensions. James filed an amended complaint that added claims for civil conspiracy, abuse of HOA authority, and based on additional research that revealed Douglas Fontaine's LLC had been in contact with a resort development company that was assembling hill country land, tortious interference with property rights, as part of a coordinated scheme to suppress the value of agricultural land adjacent to the subdivision. The amended complaint named Douglas Fontaine and Hill Country Premier Properties, LLC, as additional defendants. It included a request for discovery of all communications between Cheryl, Douglas, the Resort Development Company, and the HOA's compliance officer during the preceding 2 years. The Houston firm's response to the amended complaint was considerably less confident than their initial filings, which James described to me as a reliable indicator that the discovery process was going to produce things they would prefer remained undiscovered. It produced a great deal. The communications between Cheryl and Douglas, obtained through the discovery process, documented a scheme that had been running for 26 months. Douglas had identified the western boundary properties of Meadowbrook as the assemblage he needed for a resort development project that required a minimum of 400 contiguous acres to achieve the scale the investors required. 3 of the western boundary properties were within the subdivision and subject to HOA governance. Mine was not, but its position, 312 acres of improved ranch land directly adjacent to the assemblage, made it critical to the project's viability. The communications showed Douglas explaining to Cheryl what properties he needed and the prices he needed to pay. They showed Cheryl explaining which violations she was planning to use to pressure which property owners. They showed a timeline that correlated precisely with Frank's record of citation campaigns. And they showed, in an exchange that James described as the most useful single piece of evidence he had encountered in 20 years of practice, Cheryl telling Douglas that the ranch next door was the problem, and that she had an idea for accelerating the pressure that she thought would be decisive. The exchange was dated 3 weeks before she burned my field. The idea Cheryl had described to Douglas as decisive was burning the coastal Bermuda. She had characterized it in the message as addressing the invasive vegetation issue, while also creating a significant remediation burden that would make continued ownership of the property feel untenable. She had expressed confidence that the burn would be contained and that the weather conditions that week were favorable. She had not mentioned consulting anyone with agricultural fire expertise. She had not mentioned obtaining a permit. She had not mentioned notifying me. Douglas had responded with one word, good. James sent the communications to the district attorney the morning after we received them in discovery. Robert Chen called James that afternoon to say that the communications materially changed the criminal case, upgrading the charges from criminal negligence to intentional criminal mischief and potentially arson, and that he was going to need time to review the full discovery production before making final charging decisions. He also mentioned that the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had been in contact with his office about the resort development company's land assembly activities in the Hill Country, which suggested that what Cheryl and Douglas had been doing was not isolated to Blanco County. The FBI contact was the development that changed the scale of the case. The Resort Development Company, whose name was Texas Heritage Resorts LLC, and whose principals included investors from Houston and Austin, and one from a private equity firm based in Dallas, had been assembling Hill Country land through a coordinated strategy that involved multiple HOA-connected schemes across 4 counties. The strategy was consistent in its elements: identify agricultural land adjacent to subdivision boundaries, use HOA authority to generate pressure through violations and citations, drive property values down through sustained harassment, and acquire through connected entities at suppressed prices. The Meadowbrook scheme was one of 5 the FBI had identified. My property was one of 14 targeted agricultural parcels across the 4 counties. Federal involvement transformed the case in ways that the Houston litigation firm had clearly not anticipated when they took Cheryl's retainer. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit brought resources and jurisdiction that a county civil case did not have. And the coordination between Robert Chen's criminal prosecution and the federal investigation created a comprehensive legal pressure that was applied simultaneously on multiple fronts. Cheryl was managing a civil defense, a state criminal prosecution, and a federal investigation at the same time, with communications between her and Douglas that were now in the hands of 3 separate law enforcement entities, and whose content left limited room for alternative interpretations. Douglas retained separate counsel within 2 weeks of the amended complaint. His attorney contacted James shortly after with an interest in discussing cooperation. Douglas's cooperation agreement, negotiated with both the state and federal prosecutors, required him to provide full documentation of the land assembly scheme, the communications with Texas Heritage Resorts, the specific instructions he had given Cheryl, and the financial arrangements that had connected his property acquisitions to the resort development financing. His cooperation was comprehensive because the alternative was considerably worse. Douglas's documentation filled in the aspects of the scheme that the Cheryl Douglas communications had outlined, but not detailed. The resort development company had provided financing to Hill Country Premier Properties, LLC, on terms contingent on successful land assembly at target prices. The target prices were achievable only if the properties could be acquired below market value. The below-market acquisitions were achievable only if the HOA harassment campaigns succeeded in making ownership sufficiently unpleasant. And the HOA harassment campaigns were possible only because Cheryl had been willing to use the authority her position provided in ways that the authority was never designed to permit. The scheme was elegant in the cynical way that schemes are elegant when they are designed by people who understand systems well enough to exploit them. HOA authority is real, and its exercise looks legitimate from the outside, even when it is being used for illegitimate purposes. Violation notices look like violation notices. Citation campaigns look like enforcement. The person receiving them experiences them as targeted harassment, but the documentation they generate looks administrative. The scheme depended on that gap between appearance and reality, persisting long enough for the acquisitions to be completed. Frank Sutherland's records had closed the gap. My attorney had exploited the closing. The discovery process had documented what the records had suggested. And Cheryl's own communications had confirmed it in terms that did not require interpretation. The civil trial was scheduled 10 months after James filed the original complaint, which was fast for a case of this complexity, and reflected both the strength of the evidentiary record and the judge's assessment that extended pretrial proceedings were unlikely to change the fundamental picture. James had prepared with the thoroughness he brought to everything he considered important. An agricultural expert who had assessed the replacement value and production loss of the burned field with the precision of someone who had been calculating agricultural damages for 30 years. A fire behavior expert who testified about what a competent person with agricultural burning experience would have known about the fire's likely behavior given the morning's conditions. A financial expert who had analyzed the land assembly scheme and the financial relationships between the defendants. And Frank, whose testimony covering 18 months of documented observation was delivered with the organized precision of a retired educator who understands that clarity and sequence are the difference between information and evidence. Hector testified about what he had observed from the northern pasture. His account of seeing the smoke, calling me driving toward the field, and watching the fire cross the boundary was delivered in the straightforward sequential way of someone describing something he had witnessed, rather than reconstructing something from memory. Which is what it was, and it carried the credibility that direct observation carries, when the observer has no evident stake in the outcome beyond honesty. I testified about the field, about my grandfather planting it in 1971, about the 52 years of management and production that had preceded the morning Cheryl burned it, about the specific knowledge of fire behavior that my military service had given me, and what that knowledge told me about the decisions Cheryl had made, and what a person with adequate information would have predicted about the outcome of those decisions. James asked me to describe what I had seen when I arrived at the field, and I described it the way I have described it to you. The black ground and the smoke, and the particular silence of a place where something has been destroyed. And the courtroom was quiet in a way that courtrooms are quiet when people are imagining something they have not witnessed. Cheryl testified in her own defense. Her Houston firm had apparently concluded that her testimony was necessary to humanize a client whose written communications were difficult to humanize without her present to provide context. She testified that she had genuinely believed the field contained invasive species that posed a community hazard. She testified that she had believed her HOA authority extended to addressing hazards on adjacent properties. She testified that the wind change had been unforeseeable, and that she had taken what she described as standard precautions for a contained burn. James's cross-examination addressed each element of her testimony with the documentary record. He produced the communications with Douglas and read the relevant passages into the record. He produced the fire marshal's report and its specific findings about the inadequacy of the precautions taken. He produced the testimony of the fire behavior expert about what the morning's wind conditions should have told a person exercising adequate care. And he produced, in the final question of the cross-examination, the audio recording of Cheryl's conversation with the fire marshal, in which she had described her actions and her reasoning in terms that were inconsistent in several specific ways with the testimony she had just given. The judge asked Cheryl's counsel to address the inconsistency. The address was not satisfying. The judgment was delivered 3 weeks after closing arguments. The total award was $1,240,000, which included the agricultural damages James had calculated. The punitive damages the judge found appropriate given the intentional and conspiratorial nature of Cheryl's actions. Cheryl's share of Douglas's scheme-related liability, which the judge allocated based on her knowing participation. And attorney fees on the grounds that the defense had been conducted in a manner that unnecessarily prolonged and complicated proceedings, whose outcome the evidentiary record had made clear from an early stage. $1,240,000 for burning 40 acres of coastal Bermuda grass that she had decided contained weeds. Elijah Calloway had planted that grass in 1971, and it had produced for 52 years, and it would produce again. The replacement planting already established in the first growing season after the judgment. The coastal Bermuda coming in thick and green as it does when the soil is good, and the management is right, and the person tending it understands that what you plant carefully and tend consistently produces in proportion to the care you give it. The criminal proceedings produced a verdict that Robert Chen described as the clearest case of intentional property destruction through fire that he had prosecuted in 11 years in the office. Cheryl was convicted on all counts, the jury deliberating for 4 hours before returning with findings on criminal negligence, permit violation, and criminal mischief that together produced a sentence of 2 years in state custody and 5 years probation, with restitution payments that overlapped with the civil judgment and ensured that every dollar recoverable from Cheryl's assets was directed toward what she had destroyed. Douglas received 18 months federal and 3 years supervised release under his cooperation agreement. 3 officers of Texas Heritage Resorts LLC received sentences ranging from 24 to 36 months on federal conspiracy and fraud charges, the variation reflecting their individual involvement and the value of their cooperation. The resort development project was abandoned when the land assembly scheme collapsed, and the financing contingent on it was withdrawn, returning the hill country to the condition of not having an inauthentic resort development imposed on agricultural land that its owners had not chosen to sell. The 2 properties that Douglas had already acquired were subject to forfeiture proceedings as assets of the criminal enterprise. They were eventually returned to market at prices reflecting their actual value, rather than the suppressed values the scheme had manufactured. And one of them was purchased by a family who had been priced out of the area during the preceding decade, and who were able to afford the genuine market price now that the artificial suppression had been removed. Frank Sutherland came to the ranch the week after the criminal sentencing. He brought a bottle of Texas bourbon that he said he had been saving for a specific occasion. And we sat on the ranch house porch in the particular evening quality of hill country light that I had been watching since childhood and talked about the field and the fire and the 18 months of records he had kept and what the keeping of them had produced. Frank said he had started keeping records because he had recognized the pattern early and had concluded that patterns of this kind eventually require documentation to address effectively, and that it was better to have the documentation before you needed it than to try to reconstruct it after. He said this in the matter-of-fact tone of a man who spent 30 years teaching people to organize information and had not stopped thinking that way in retirement. I said he was the most useful neighbor I had encountered in my life outside of military service, where the usefulness of the people around you is a matter of some consequence. He said he had thought about my grandfather's field, about 52 years of coastal Bermuda, about what it takes to establish something that well and manage it that carefully, and pass it through 2 generations of stewardship, and have it destroyed in a morning by someone who had not thought carefully enough about wind. He said he thought about that whenever he was tempted to let his record-keeping lapse. The temptation passes quickly. The replacement planting was coming in well by the time the civil judgment was paid. Coastal Bermuda establishes in the first growing season under good conditions, and the conditions that year were good, adequate rainfall, warm temperatures through the establishment period, and the particular benefit of soil that had been supporting the same grass species for over 50 years, and remembered, in the biological sense that soil remembers things, how to do it. By the second growing season, the field was producing at levels approaching what it had produced before the fire. And by the third season, Hector told me, it was producing better than he had seen it produce in a decade, which he attributed to the reset that the burn had provided to the soil, and the vigor of new establishment versus aging stand. I do not know if that is accurate, or if Hector was finding the silver lining with the generous interpretation that people who have worked land for decades bring to the resilience of good ground. But the field was green and producing, and the cattle were moving through it in the pattern that cattle establish on familiar pasture. And standing at the eastern fence line on a clear morning, watching the grass move in the hill country wind that had been blowing in these particular hills, since before anyone alive had been here to observe it. I thought about Elijah planting that grass in 1971, with the long-term thinking of a rancher who understood that good pasture is built over decades, and about what it had taken to protect the investment of those decades when someone had decided it was disposable. I thought about Frank's records and James's preparation and Hector's phone call from the northern pasture, and Marcus Webb reading the burn pattern, with 16 years of fire investigation knowledge, and Robert Chen understanding what the communications between Cheryl and Douglas meant for the charges he could bring. I thought about the specific chain of competent attention that had connected the morning Cheryl, set the fire to the afternoon the judgment was paid, and the evening Frank and I sat on the porch watching Hill Country Light do what Hill Country Light does in the hour before dark. I thought about the wind, about the specific meteorological fact that wind in the Texas Hill Country in that season shifts from north to south, in the morning hours, with a regularity that any person familiar with the local conditions would recognize. About what Cheryl had not known, or had not thought to ask about, or had not cared to consider before she gave the instruction to set the fire. About how the wind had done in 40 minutes what the legal system had taken considerably longer to accomplish, which was to make the consequences of her decision fall precisely and completely on the person who had made it. Drop a comment right now and tell me something. Tell me whether you are documenting what is happening to you. Tell me whether you know your property rights specifically enough to defend them when someone tests them. Tell me whether you have a Frank Sutherland in your community, someone who is paying attention and keeping records and understanding that the documentation you accumulate before you need it is the only kind that is reliable when you need it. Because Cheryl Fontaine believed that the authority she had was real, that the wind would cooperate, and that the consequences of her decision would fall on me. She was wrong about all three, but she would have been less wrong about all three if Frank had not kept his records and James had not prepared, and Hector had not called me from the northern pasture the moment he saw the smoke. The outcome of this story was not inevitable. It was built. One documented observation at a time. One carefully prepared legal filing at a time. One piece of evidence that was available because someone had thought ahead far enough to preserve it. Know your land, know your rights, document what happens. Find the Frank Sutherlands in your community and take care of them because they are taking care of you. And if someone ever tells you they are going to set a fire on land adjacent to yours, ask them what the wind forecast says. Cheryl did not ask. The wind had its own answer. Hit subscribe because next week I am going to tell you about a family that discovered their HOA president had been collecting dues for a community amenity that had never been built. And what happened when they compared the bank statements to the construction records. And why the president who had been depositing those dues spent the subsequent period explaining herself to federal bank fraud investigators. The field is green. The cattle are moving through it. The wind is from the north this morning, clear and steady. carrying the smell of cedar and live oak, and the particular quality of hill country air that my grandfather breathed when he planted that grass in 1971. Some things, properly tended and properly defended, come back stronger than they were before. Tend your land, defend your rights, document everything, and watch the wind.